So characteristics of metadata schemas. Taylor and Chowdhury also identify characteristics of metadata schemas, but please note that these are different than the items on the last slide, which are types of elements. Descriptive, structural, and administrative are categories to which individual elements may be assigned to further describe that element's function. So that's the last slide. On this slide, we see that entire metadata schemas have certain characteristics that we can use to examine them. So first we have semantics. A schema's semantics are what the schema means, especially the meaning of the individual elements. Sometimes the label for an element isn't especially revealing. So the Dublin Core uses the creator element, but that can refer to authors, illustrators, or editors. So in any given case, which one? The notes about the semantics can help you to know what is meant by creator. Does that mean the date the resource was published or the date that it was acquired in the collection? One can usually find out about the semantics of metadata elements by reading the descriptions and scope notes that are available within the metadata schema. And again, these are only available to the information professionals. These aren't available to end users. But anyway, looking at the descriptions and scope notes is similar to what you do in Activity 1 with this session by looking deeply into the elements that make up two metadata schemas, EAD and MARC. So the second one, syntax. Syntax is basically the grammar for filling out the schema. Schemas are almost universally computerized now, so syntax usually pertains to the character sets and or the programming or tagging languages, like XML or even JavaScript or however things are presented and formatted. Syntax pertains to the character sets and markup languages that are used to create and populate a metadata record using that schema. Again, syntax applies at the schema level, just as semantics does, even though in a schema you can learn about the semantics by looking at the individual elements. But one element might have slightly different semantics in schema A than that same element might have in schema B. So that's why it's said that semantics, syntax, and structure apply at the schema level. The structure, which is the third characteristic, the structure of a metadata schema refers to how the schema is organized. In what order do the elements go? Elements aren't just, slapped into a metadata schema in the order that was thought of by the people who created the schema. Instead, they're usually there in a meaningful order. So how are things grouped? Is the schema hierarchical, where catalogers can drill down into subfields or sub-elements to describe certain characteristics in more detail? Again, like I said on the earlier slide about the types of metadata elements, these three characteristics of metadata schemas, they don't by any stretch of the imagination represent all of the possible characteristics of metadata schemas, but these three are particularly useful ones that we can use to examine and compare one or more metadata schemas. So we've talked so far about some, sort of general characteristics of metadata, whether it's metadata elements or metadata schema, and we've gone through and sort of defined how the different components of this metadata process work together, with metadata schemas being created by assembling metadata elements and giving each metadata element whatever content standards it needs to be consistent and useful in the situation. So we create schemas, or perhaps we use pre-existing schemas after a process of, doing enough research to identify the schema that's right for whatever your organization's needs are. And then you apply the schema by using the schema like a blank template to fill out every time you have a new information resource to catalog. Then you just fill out the individual elements of the schema with whichever characteristics are present in the resource that you're currently cataloging. So that's sort of, and from that process, I should say, you get a metadata record or a surrogate record. So that's sort of the overall process of how everything gets done with metadata. But when you're in the process of creating or selecting a metadata schema for your organization, I think it's a good idea to sort of frame your selection process by sort of having two columns of decision-making criteria that you need to talk about among your colleagues. And one column has to deal with principle, that's sort of the high-level stuff, the pie in the sky, things like the mission of the organization and user needs and meeting those needs in a perfect world, and kind of figuring out, like, if this thing was going to be perfect, what would be its characteristics in our particular context? And then in the other column, you sort of have those questions or characteristics that have to do with the practicality of the schema that you're talking about, whether it's one that you want to adopt into the organization that already exists or you're creating a new one. So if you're going to adopt a new metadata schema, what's the technical feasibility? If you're looking at MARC, do you have the right equipment for creating MARC records? And with human resources, do you have people on staff who have the expertise, or at least can be reasonably trained with your available money, to create records that would actually work in the MARC environment, that would use the proper escape characters and subfields, and it takes a lot of training to learn how to construct a MARC record. If you're looking at a smaller scale sort of organization that doesn't need to worry about participating in the MARC program, which involves sharing cataloging records across thousands and thousands of organizations internationally. If you're not interested in that, maybe you can come up with your own metadata schema and sort of answer those practical and principle questions as they come up. So the scope and the scale of how these things get done, and the amount of emphasis that you either can or have to put on principle or practicality really depends on so many factors, some of which pertain to the information resources themselves, but many of which pertain just to, the normal stuff that pertains to making any decision in a knowledge organization or any kind of work organization. And those ones that fall under practicality are especially true here. So those are just things to keep in mind. We talk about creating metadata and metadata schemas and using them as though we could do it the right way or the most principled way every time. But I think it's always good to sort of throw that pragmatic wrench in there and be sure to sort of consider what the ramifications might be on the practical level, because that's usually when you get out into the field and you're actually doing this stuff, you end up finding out that little teeny tiny nitty gritty details can railroad an entire project or completely change how a metadata schema gets applied, just because of the operating system that's used on your company's servers, for instance. So just keep in mind how details like that can really change how metadata gets implemented in an individual organization.